Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey everyone, BUMD Flyer here. In this video I'm going to show you how to make swamp bases. There's a bunch of techniques included in this which will be applicable to all kinds of other elements and bases that you may be interested in making as well. I've got two bases ready to go. I used filler putty, epoxy, and texture paste. I also built them on the new plastic flat bases because I wanted a flat area for the water. It'll really help the effect with the water if you have a flat surface to use. As you can see here, I used flat plastic bases, but you can also sand flat a epoxy or a filler in a normal hex base if you wish. You can see here I've got them primed now. They're just a black primer. You can also use a dark brown. Any dark color will work, whatever you have on hand. Here's the colors I used for these bases. I've got Reaper Peacock Green and Vallejo Model Color German Camo Black Brown for my base colors. For my highlight colors, I'll be using Vallejo Model Color US Field Drab and Reaper Bones Dungeon Slime. I'll also be using Army Painter Quick Shade Dark Tone for my black wash. You don't have to have these specific colors to do this, but try to find something similar if you're going for the same effect. Feel free to substitute in any of your other color palette to make it the way that you want to make it. I've put all my paints on my palette paper because you don't need to worry about them drying out. We'll do all of this at once, even though the paint will still be dry on most of the base. Start by taking the water areas and applying the peacock green or whatever dark green you want to use. Don't put it on so thick that it's going to have a texture to it. You should have a little bit of thinness, but don't have it runny either. You want to get a good coat. If it takes you 2 coats to get a decent covering over your primer, that's perfectly fine. Continue working until you get a good effect on the green, and then once that's started to dry, move over to your brown and start base coating the terrain or the earth elements that you want to have on your base. Again, apply it the same way you did before, getting good coverage, filling in any gaps, and not leaving anything exposed that you don't want to show up later. You can see the second coat that I put on my bases to fill everything out is still drying. I've gone to my Army Painter black wash to start darkening the green in the water. And I know the camera is not going to show this very well because of the way the light's going to reflect, but it's going to help add a little bit of that sense of depth and a shoreline, if you will, towards the edges. The reason I'm using Army Painter is because it's much thicker. Nuln Oil looks a little bit too runny for this application, so Army Painter washes right out of the bottle and not thinned down are really great for this type of shading effect. Again, I'm just putting it right over the wet paint. I'm not using the brush in a traditional sense. I'm actually more dabbing it and stippling it onto the water so that I don't disturb the paint below it. You can see I've got a paper towel and I've started grabbing my highlight brown. I'm removing a lot of the paint off of the brush, but this isn't a traditional dry brush. The paint's still wet on my base. I'm just going to gently apply pressure to catch the raised surfaces just like I would if I were dry brushing, but I'm going to get a little bit more of the paint mixing together, so it will kind of merge as I'm brushing it on and it'll start to darken the paint. Even as you see it on the paper towel, the colors are running together, which is fine. You don't have to do it this way if you prefer to let it dry completely and just do a traditional dry brush. That's up to you. But I kind of like the idea of a little bit of a stippling technique to really get some different variations on the dirt surface. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. On this other base I'm working at the same time, I've got a lot more of the highlight brown on the exposed areas. And my thinking was that the dirt's higher, it's further away from the water, it's going to be a little bit more dry, and I just wanted to do something a little bit different. I've got an old brush that I cut half the bristles off of and use it for stippling. And I'm going to go with this Dungeon Slime paint, and we're going to start working on the water to basically add a shoreline of algae or scum or whatever stuff that might grow on the shoreline. Maybe the water's receded a little bit. You want some gooey, weird alien stuff on the side there. That's totally up to you, but this is what I'm going to use to get that effect. You don't have to use a purpose-built stippling brush. Like I said, I just used an old one that I cut the bristles. You can also go to the makeup sections of pretty much any store that has brushes and use those eye makeup bristle brushes. They kind of have a rounded edge, which is actually more beneficial. The reason I'm not using one of those here is because it's such a small area with tight quarters. I felt that I would get more paint on the shoreline than I would where I wanted it to go. So, and you can use a regular brush as well, but that old brush that I was using for the base coating, I could have done it with that as well. It's just, I'm just showing you the different things that you can do to apply paint in different ways and make it look interesting. I'm going pretty heavy towards the shoreline, up to the shoreline, and then as I stipple out, I'm building up the paint, and then once I get kind of the level or the thickness, width of the color, I start to go to this where the wash and the green paint is still kind of damp, and I'm just kind of trying to make them mingle together a little bit. And it's a bit of a back and forth, and it does take a little bit of getting used to. Once you kind of get it about where you want it, move on to something else, or let it kind of settle for a little bit. And the reason is that if you do too much too fast, you can end up with just a big goopy line of paint, and you don't get any sort of blend or transition into the depth. And if you want to have gummy algae, red, purple, green, whatever color you want to do all over the entire surface, that's fine. I'm just trying to have a little bit of variation so that it doesn't look all uniform in the same color. On this base, I decided I wanted to have a lot more of the surface algae and pond scum covering the water area. So you can see I went with much more of the dungeon slime paint, and I'm just working it up. I'm not really worried about blending it right yet, but I'm going to kind of transition on the edges to help myself out later. Again, I've got it about where I think I want it to be, but I'm not going to finish it. And that's the only amount of time I waited for the other base to dry. And now I'm going to go again and repeat the step that I did on the original base when I started, and I'm going to do this process over again, and it's going to reinforce some of those brighter areas where the paint has settled out and you've got a little bit of muting now because of the colors merging, and then the paint dries, it's not as bright. So you can really get a feel for how high or how low of a contrast level you want. I switched to a wider brush to start stippling. It's one of the ones that I made as well, and I think I cut it too short and the bristles are just a little too stiff. It took me a few rounds to kind of figure out what angle to hold the brush, and again, this is where having an actual dedicated brush or even the rounded dome-shaped makeup brushes would be much more beneficial, because you actually get an uneven application surface, which is actually better. So it kind of took me a little bit to figure this out, but once I got the paint loaded about where I needed it to be and was able to kind of get a feel for the brush, it started to apply in the stipple pattern that I was looking for. Now I'm going to go pretty heavy on this, and you're going to be wondering why. Oh my gosh, you put too much paint on there, you just covered up everything you did. Well, the paint again is still wet on the water surface. It's not completely wet like it was when we started, but there's still wet paint underneath there. That green is still damp, as well as that wash we put over it. So these are all going to merge together, and that green's going to mute out really quickly over a really dark color like that. It's a yellow, it's a light green, it's not going to do yellow things over a dark color. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to cover up a lot of these areas with more of this dungeon slime paint to really help this blend phase that comes after this step. You can see I've got quite a bit of that dungeon slime working its way out towards the darker areas, and now I've switched to my original base coating brush. It's a little softer, and I wasn't happy with the way that first stippling brush was doing what it wanted to do, what I wanted it to do. So this will give me a little bit more control, and it's a smaller surface area as well to be a little bit more accurate on where I want to blend. I've gone back into the peacock green, and now I'm blending with the still wet yellow or dungeon slime color, and I'm basically blurring the line between the darkest area where I originally wanted it to be dark with the wash and the green, and I'm making things happen in between the two layers. The wet paint is going to do a little bit of the work for you. It's not going to be a cure-all for everything, but it's going to help out. So now I'm just starting in the depth areas and just using gentle shoves. I'm just nudging the paint, really. I'm not trying to apply a whole bunch, and I'm not trying to do too much movement of the paint all at once. And again, it's a back and forth process. You might find one side looks better than the other. Well, if you're happy with it, stop working it. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be worked over again. And you can always go back and forth between the two. And in fact, I'm going to add some dungeon slime back in after this, because I wanted it to go a little bit on the brighter side, and I got a little too heavy in the green, but I'm not going to go all the way up to the edge because I don't want that yellow to be muted and be muted toward the edge. So I've got the brightest paint there, and then I'm going to kind of almost stipple nudge it towards the depth area. And again, this is very, very forgiving. The paint's wet, and if you don't like it, it's easy to put a dark coat of green paint over it and start over. And just let it, I would let the original layer that you're not happy with dry completely before you did that, though. Otherwise, you get all kinds of things merging underneath there. You can see now it's got a good, nice transition between the two, and I'm just going to repeat the process here on this other one, doing the same method. And you can start with the yellow, you can start with the dark green, go with whatever you're trying to make your base look like. I'm just finishing up the last little bits of yellow blend here, and as you can see, they look really good for not a whole lot of actual true blending. So this is where you're going to want to let everything completely dry. So set them down and let the paint completely dry before we go to the next step where we dry brush. I'm going to be using Reaper Master Series Terran Khaki, or any light brown or khaki color will work. This will be just to highlight the raised edges of the textures on the earth sections here that we have. So do whatever technique you like for highlighting your dirt. I'm just going to use this dry brush technique to keep things moving along. You can see I went pretty heavy on these highlights because now I'm taking the Army Painter dark tone that we used previously and I'm doing a wash over the entire thing. And the thinking behind this is that I'm looking at dirt that's next to a water area. It's probably going to be fairly damp and kind of saturated and dark, and I'm going to add some flocking and things like that at the end of it anyway. So this just adds yet another bit of depth to the palette. You don't have to do it over all the surfaces. You can break it up a little bit. You can do just certain areas closer to the water line. There's a lot of things you can do with this, but you just see here I'm coating everything. I did let that wash dry completely, and then I sprinkled some flock over some white glue or PVA to add some low-level vegetation to the bases. You can use clump foliage, you can use any kind of flocking that you prefer. You can even use static grass, whatever it is that you like. The focus now is on pre-fitting the miniature, and you can see I've already drilled a couple of holes outside of where the foot is going to be in contact with, because now what I'm doing is positioning on the base to determine where I'm going to put shrubs, small tufts of grass, as well as the higher like cattails or reeds that I want to show you how to do a little bit later. If you have the option to add 2 or 3 or even 4 types of vegetation, I think that'll really help for a base that is supposed to be near water and all kinds of stuff growing and things like that. So you can see I've got these static tufts and I'll be applying some of those. To do the reeds or cattails, I've got some Woodland Scenics field grass here. It's about 2 or 3 inches of this hair-like stuff. And I've got some clamping tweezers and some gel super glue to help me facilitate getting these into the pre-drilled holes that I've already put into the base. I've crimped down a bunch of these grass strands into a tweezers, and I've got some sharp scissors or cutters, and I've grabbed a pinch of the bristles, and now I'm just going to try to kind of twist them together a little bit and then put some glue on the end that's going to end up being in the base, in the hole. So that'll allow some adhesion at the very base as well as to help kind of keep them together to fit in the hole. And you might have to kind of massage some of it in. They may not all fit in there. This is very fiddly. This is a kind of a somewhat frustrating and time-consuming process depending on how good you are and how dexterous you may be, but I do like the overall finished appearance. Now the glue is still drying, so you can kind of do a little positioning with your tweezers or a hobby knife or whatever. You're going to have stuff that's going to be kind of sticking out. Resist the urge to do what I just did and pluck at them right now, because if you start pulling some of them out, you might take the whole tuft out and then you'll have to start over. Let them dry for a little bit, and you can see I've got some that are a little bit too tall. Some people might say they're all too tall. Whatever scale, it's your alien planet world, whatever. If you want them to be reeds or cattails or whatever, trim them down shorter. If you want them to be giant climbing rando vines, that's up to you. So you can do a little bit of the kind of arranging and trimming, do a little bonsai zen approach to it until you're happy with the number of reeds and results. The last thing I like to do to these reeds is to take a dark wash like this Army Painter Strong Tone, which is a dark brown base, and apply it to the roots or the lower areas of the vegetation to make it look a little bit more, like a plant with a little bit more depth and realism to it. So I'll do this on all kinds of different plants, especially the lighter colored ones where the contrast was really much more apparent. Now if you want to have the water look to be more wet and damp, you can do a couple of things. You can apply a clear gloss varnish or even a satin varnish. I like to use Secret Weapon Realistic Water. I've used it in some of my other videos as well. It requires 2 to 3 layers. It dries fairly quickly. It's water-based, but you can apply that. The other thing I like to do actually is once it's dry, to give it not so shiny of a appearance, is I'll actually just from a farther away distance while I'm varnishing my miniatures, I will hold it away so that it doesn't completely coat. So there's just a little bit of a sheen, but it's not super reflective. And here they are all sealed up with a matte clear coat so that they're nice and muted down and ready to go onto the table. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please click subscribe. Leave your questions or comments in the sections below. Follow us on Facebook at Camo Specs Online. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Shutdown sequence initiated.